show our links, guys. I'm going to try, so this is a chat I've given before in variable lengths. I've got a little bit more time here than I've had at other spots, so I kind of wanted to dig into some of the stuff in a bit more detail. But also considering the size of the group, it'd be nice if I can get through some of this quicker so we can get to maybe some conversational stuff. But if I speed through something, just make a note and then we'll come back to it at the end and chat about it in more detail. Okay, I'm Nick Briz. I know half of the folks. The other half, I'll let you know that I'm a new media artist / organizer / educator. So I make work with, but also about the technology that's come to define the era that we're living in. And today I want to talk about one sort of perspective, practice, ethic, that lens that I kind of like approached a lot of that work through, that I've been calling tactical misuse. Before I talk about what that is, or how I do that, I want to talk about what that is, and before I talk about what that is, I want to talk about why I do that. So that's my outline for today. Why, what, how, or why, how, what. And I want to start here. So this is a piece I did in 2011 with my friend Raymond Ranger and my cousin Paul Briz. It's a cell phone charging station. This was for Miami. I mean, we've shown it at a few different places, but it was initially made for a few galleries during Miami Art Basel that year. And they had asked us to make a station, just like cell phone charging stations, that would also be like creative and cool and interactive. Because folks need to charge their phones, taking a lot of photos during Art Basel. But we decided to take that prompt and the kind of cool interactive part. We figured we'd make it sort of a metaphor for the exchange that happens with online services that was happening then and is still happening today. So the way that the charging station worked is that inscribed around this plexiglass cube were the terms and conditions of this charging station. And it's hard to read in the image, but I've got like this back panel here. This is what that back panel there says. It says, you grant Ranger Briz an irrevocable, perpetual, non-exclusive, transferable, fully paid, worldwide license to use, copy, publish, stream, store, retain, publicly perform, or display, etc., 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 any and all images retrieved. And the reason it says that is because on the other side of this charging station, there's a screen. And when you plug your phone in, you see a little message that says, phone detected, charging your phone, downloading all your photos, projecting your photos in the gallery. And so then elsewhere in the gallery, we project the photos that are being downloaded from people's phones as they're charging. I also want to say that we glitch those photos and blur those photos, so other people can't necessarily tell what's going on, but ideally you recognize your own photos in the collage of photos. And the idea is we wanted to get people to think about this exchange, this idea that when we feel like something is free online, it's rarely free. You're actually exchanging, usually, data for some service. And in 2011, I think we had a very different understanding of what that meant than we do today. But this is still the exchange. I want to talk about terms and conditions. I loathe terms and conditions, not just because they're super long and impossible to understand, but sort of fundamentally what the deal is, what the exchange is with a lot of these online services, which, and I'm going to oversimplify, boils down to, say, like in the case of Facebook, the deal, the terms that we're agreeing to is they give us a platform where we can upload photos and chat with friends, as though that was something incredibly unique and novel that we can't do somewhere else. And in exchange, we give them all of our data, a lot of our data. I think that exchange isn't a fair one. I think it's incredibly unbalanced. I think they're getting way more value in that exchange than we are. But we do it anyways, I think in part because this form of capitalism, I want to talk about in a bit more depth in a sec, surveillance capitalism, is still kind of new, and we still don't know how to negotiate, in this case, our data in these new exchanges, in the same way that we know how to, say, negotiate our labor within older forms of capitalism. An anecdote I like to give my students a lot of times is I say, if I invited you to my house and I asked you to mow my lawn, you'd probably say no. or you'd say how much, right? And we might negotiate an exchange. You know, you understand what your labor in that context is worth. If I said, I'm not going to pay you anything, but all your friends will be there, hopefully you won't agree to that. But we do agree to that in this kind of surveillance capitalist context in terms of exchanging our data. We're like, oh, my friends are there, cool, have everything. I think in part that's because we still don't, while in 2011, I think this was like a pretty new idea to people. Like when I would ask students, like, how do you think Facebook and Google make money? They would usually look at me with kind of blank stares, like, yeah, how do they make? That's a good question. Now we know that there's this data exchange, but we still don't know like exactly what that means, how that works, and what the consequences of that are still very vague. So I kind of want to dive into that a little bit. We could dive in way deeper maybe with Q&A if we have time, but just kind of high level. Oh, and yeah, a note on this too. Again, like I said, that exchange is super unbalanced. When you start to kind of dig into it and understand it, it's easy to feel like a sucker in terms of like what you've agreed to. Mark Zuckerberg uses much stronger language. He described us as dumb fucks for trusting him with his data. This is a while ago, and he was young and he was in college, but I think it's important to remember that when we use these services, we're inherently trusting a group of people. We don't think about that. Like it's rare to ask yourself the question, do I trust this guy? But your actions ultimately imply that you are. So what kinds of data? When we say that they have all of our data, what are we talking about? This is very high level, but at least to start to tease this out a little bit. The top 1 or 2 points is maybe what people typically think of, like disclosed data. This idea that like the stuff that you post to Facebook, the photos you're posting, the comments you're leaving, the messages you're sending, this is a big chunk of the data they have. But they also have metadata, which is data about those pieces of data that they generate, that they record. So where were you when you made that post? What time was it when you made that post? How are you feeling, like sentiment analysis, when you made that post? So this kind of paints a bigger picture. Then there's behavioral data. So this is data generated from your habits. It's similar to metadata in that it's something that they assume based on things that are going on. One example is what Facebook calls self-censorship. So they published a study on this. They showed that 71% of their users exhibit this kind of behavior, what they call self-censorship. And what this is, like you might have been out really late one night, you're a little bit drunk, you come home, you're about to post something on a friend's wall, you type it all out, and you're like, maybe I shouldn't post what I'm going to post, and then you backspace, and decide not to do that. Facebook records that. They record that you started typing that, what it is that you typed, and the fact that you removed it and decided not to post. This is information they use to sort of understand us even more. Then there's third-party data. So it's not just the stuff that Facebook has. Facebook buys data from data brokers and other people, and then they bring it into their internal profiles on their users. And these are data brokers that have, like, in some cases, up to 300 data points on any individual. Sometimes people have done some research here where sometimes up to 50% of that data is wrong, which opens up another can of worms in terms of false positives and misclassification. But just to say that it's not just the data Facebook has and generates, but also stuff they purchase elsewhere that then becomes a bigger pile of data. Then there's incidental data, the stuff that other people share about you. So maybe you don't post photos to Facebook. Maybe you don't even have a Facebook account, but your friends might, and they might post photos about you. And it used to be the case that Facebook didn't know who was in a photo, but we've spent all this time tagging photos for the last few years, which have trained machine learning models that they have on their servers that can now recognize who's who in a photo without us having to actually tag people. So if your friend uploads a photo of you, there's a good chance that they know that that's you. And if you don't even have a Facebook profile, Facebook's actually, there's something known as shadow profiles, where they'll create profiles for people that they have tons of data on that don't necessarily have a Facebook account. So they can still kind of use that in their system. Then there's derived data. So this is data inferred by correlating all of the above. So it's another sort of layer, or higher sort of dimensional layer of information. One example, they took out a patent a couple years ago on how to algorithmically determine people's social class based on all of their data. So really high level, but just to kind of stress this point that it's not just the stuff we're posting to Facebook. When we say that they have all of our data and this exchange we've agreed to is to allow them to have all this data, we're talking a lot of data. And this data is incredibly powerful, especially today in the age of machine learning that we're sort of in. This data is used, so when we think about what do they do with this data, probably most of us know that it has something to do with advertising. They use it to do kind of like targeted ads, but even this is like oftentimes not fully understood or sort of oversimplified. It's less about ads and it's more about predictions. And it just so happens that predictions lend themselves to targeted ads, but also to other things. So like classic example of this kind of prediction, and this is from a bit ago, this is 2012, this is Target. Target, you know, the way that predictions work is when you have a lot of data, you can identify patterns in that data, and then you can make predictions about what someone's going to do, or feel or think, based on the fact that they're exhibiting the same patterns that they've recorded in other people. So with Target, this was a story that got a lot of press. There was a girl who was pregnant, didn't tell her parents. She received these ads in the mail, pregnancy-related stuff, and her parents were upset. How dare you send my very young daughter this information? And Target was like, well, she's pregnant. Sorry to let you know. And it's because she exhibited certain patterns, like switching from buying scented shampoos to unscented shampoos, which is a thing that happens when you're pregnant. You become more sensitive to smells, and you might want to shift to less scented stuff. So just in her behaviors, they were able to identify patterns that gave them information about her, in this case that she was pregnant. These days there's this thing that we hear a lot about where people are like, are our phones listening to us? Because like, yesterday I was just talking to my friend about possibly taking a trip to Panama, and then today I got an ad to go to Panama. Maybe our phones are listening to us. I mean, maybe, but all these companies have denied that. They're not recording this, you know, like listening to our conversations, and it's likely they don't really need to. Like they don't know. Like Google doesn't know what you're saying. Google knows what you're thinking. This is the power, right? Like when you have so much information and you can make these predictions. It's not that they knew we were talking about Panama yesterday, it's that they knew that around that time, we were probably going to be thinking about Panama because we've exhibited the behaviors that they've identified in all this data that everyone else who eventually thinks about Panama at this time was previously exhibiting. So chances are, our heads are going to be thinking about Panama. And again, this is used to then target ads to us, like, hey, here's an ad for Panama. Also target ads to us at just the right time when we're in the mind space to possibly purchase that ticket. This is also information that they can derive and predict. So to say ads is like, you know, this is a much more insidious form of advertising, but it's beyond that. These predictions can be sold to other people who are interested in that information for other reasons. So recently Microsoft did a study, and other folks have done similar studies with machine learning, where they can, based on in some cases they look at your mouse movements. Say like you're on a website and you can record people's mouse movements when they're on a website. So if you're on a certain website like Bing, they can see like how you're moving your mouse or how you're typing in a keyboard. And because they have data about folks who have certain neurological diseases like Parkinson's or something, and they can see how they move their mouse and have data and how their movements have kind of changed over time, they can now predict if you have a similar neurological disease before you even know that you have that disease. Now the question is, if we were, another kind of anecdote or saying here is like, you know, if it's free, you're not the customer, you're the product. So if we're not their customers, these companies have no incentive to let us know that we might have that potential, you know, disease coming up. But some of their customers, like insurance companies, might be very interested in that information. So these algorithmic predictions have way more implications than just manipulative ads. And then the third piece to this surveillance capitalism equation is systematic manipulation. I'm already kind of implying that a little bit in what I said in terms of finding the right time to show you that ad. That's a kind of a sneaky little trick in terms of making sure that you optimize how many people click on that link or buy that thing. But Facebook and others in this camp are constantly doing experiments, are constantly testing how they can control and manipulate people on and more importantly offline. These are just some examples. Facebook has figured out how to get you to have interactions with friends that you would otherwise find awkward or uncomfortable. But if you do that, they save a lot of money in content moderation. So they've manipulated people into having exchanges with others that they themselves don't even realize necessarily that this is why they're doing this thing they otherwise would consider as awkward. This is how low I can get into details in Q&A if folks are curious about that one. This voting experiment they ran actually twice, so this is pretty like, you know, they confirmed it, that they, just by changing your feed and showing you certain posts, even in this case a single post, they were able to get people who otherwise weren't going to vote to go out and vote. That could be used for all sorts of good in terms of like improving participation in our democracy. But given Facebook's track record in their relationship with democracy and elections and politics, that could also be used in not so great ways. And in their studies, they got 300,000 plus people to vote. So we're talking numbers that are enough to swing an election when you think about the last couple that we've had here. Another example, this one was particularly popular in 2014. It got a lot of press. They ran this experiment. They wanted to see if just by manipulating our feeds, if they could make certain people happier and certain people sadder. It turns out, yes, they could. For a couple weeks in 2014, they made 700,000 people sad, or some percentage of 700,000 people sad, and 700,000 people happy. And that's also a really powerful tool when you're trying to get people to buy stuff. And these are just some examples, but just to say that this is another piece. It's not just that they're getting all our data. All the data is then used to create predictions that are very profitable, and so to all sorts of people. And then those same systems more recently are also used to manipulate us. So I've already mentioned this word a couple of times. This is what folks are calling surveillance capitalism, in particular Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a book a couple of years ago, really big, massive book on this whole sort of practice. She defines surveillance capitalism as an economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales, in all of the aforementioned ways. A couple little side notes before I go down an even more leftist sort of rabbit hole. I want to say up front, I'm not anti-capitalism, and nor am I anti-social media, before I continue to rail on social media. Like, I love the idea of social media. Like, I think the internet's real strength, and one of its most important characteristics is the way that it can connect people, the way it breaks down geographic borders, the way that it brings people with common interests together. I think if you look at the history of the internet, some of the greatest achievements, for better or worse, have all had to do with people coming together, connecting individuals, and I think that's awesome. I love, like in tech, we have this idea of like specifications and implementations. Somebody designs what a technology should look like, and then somebody actually goes out and implements it, makes it real. I love the specification of social media. I just hate the implementation. Similarly, I love the specification of capitalism. I just hate the implementation. I'm criticizing the implementation, not the core sort of ideas behind some of these things, which I think we can do better. It's kind of part of this, the whole reason for having this conversation. Do this stuff better. So this is the why. Moving on to the how and the what. So tactical misuse, this term I introduced at the beginning, is one form of resistance that I'm pitching to you all against surveillance capitalism. Keyword there being one form. I'll come back to this at the very end, but this is like a collective problem. Collective problems require collective action. So this is a piece of potentially a much more complicated puzzle, but a piece I'm trying to kind of share, contribute, invite you to partake in. So what does resistance in the context of tactical misuse look like? Some background of where I'm kind of coming from, what some of my influences are, especially as an artist / activist. We could probably start earlier than this, but I'll just start here. Situation is, are folks familiar with these folks? So this is some people, yes, people know. So this is a group of artists, mostly in France, but consider themselves pretty international. In starting the late 50s into the 60s, they railed against what they called the Society of the Spectacle. They had techniques. They developed these techniques like detornment, which would take, quote, expressions of the capitalist system and its media culture and turn it against itself. So that detornment was really all about essentially remix. They'd take films and music and comic books and billboards, and they would turn the messages that they were projecting like they sort of invert them by sort of going and remixing those messages. This influenced a whole wave of artists that came afterwards, like in the 80s, like what were known as like culture jammers. I don't know if people are familiar with these artists, but it's like Negative Land and a Barbary Liberation Organization and the Billboard Liberation Front, people like Plunderphonics and John Oswald and others. They sort of brought those same sort of ethics into like the 80s, taking again these artifacts of mainstream media, of capitalism, specifically the media, music, sound, films, billboards, and remix them. Like that Stella Artois billboard used to say, "She is a thing of beauty." Just by removing the of beauty part, the subtext there becomes very clear. And again, this took many shapes, music and films and other stuff. But what I really was always really inspired by in terms of these folks was the way that they looked at media, not just as like products that we're supposed to consume, as messages that we're sort of digesting, but as an environment. Like we're surrounded by media. John Oswald of Plunderphonics used to say that like he doesn't have a choice in terms of whether he hates pop music, but he has to listen to it because it's everywhere. It's in all the stores he walks into. It was in the Walkmans of people's pouring out, and so he was forced to listen to this. And so even though this work was always illegal, it always broke copyright. There was defacement of stuff out in the streets. It wasn't unethical, right? They felt like it was their prerogative, right, to sort of criticize this media environment that they were living in and sort of respond back to it, as artists always do, take from their environment and respond to that. And then this kind of inspired another wave of folks, what are known as tactical media artists. So we have the Electronic Disturbance Theater and Irrational.org and IOD and other folks like Artmark and a whole group of like early net artists that sort of brought these techniques into the digital age. But this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated, bringing these techniques into the digital age. For a couple reasons. Well, I want to talk about this word tactical because it has a sort of colloquial sort of definition, but it has a particular meaning in this context with these artists. So they were sort of like alluding to this book, The Practice of Everyday Life by Michel de Certeau. Are people familiar with this book? Okay. But drastically oversimplify, it's a really cool book from the 80s. But the idea, so this word, de Certeau, the author of this book, uses these terms strategies and tactics to mean something real specific. So his idea was, despite the fact that, he felt we lived in the kind of the various repressive aspects of modern society, there was this creative potential that he observed, that he noticed that everyday people, not necessarily artists, just like everyday people would do these things that would shift, at least momentarily in little instances, power dynamics. And so he talks about strategies versus tactics. The idea being like strategies are what the man uses. Is like people in certain organizations and positions of power. That could be like a nation state, but that could also be a university, and that could also be a corporation. That they have certain ideas about how the system, how society should work, and then they implement those ideas. They realize them using these strategies in the way that they produce a certain system that then controls the flows, the thoughts, the actions, the minds of the everyday people inhabiting those systems. And then what he calls tactics, his use of this word tactics, is when these individuals would seize opportunities to take the sort of elements of these systems and kind of flip them and use them against perhaps their intended purpose. And this could be all sorts of things. An example he gives in the book is sort of like, a cane might be made for walking, but Charlie Chaplin uses it for all sorts of other things. There might be a certain way that you're supposed to navigate a city, right? Like the folks on top might construct the city in a certain way that then allows certain people access to certain things and others not, and certain people, but then the way that we might choose to navigate the city, we might choose to use an alley versus a street allows us to at least temporarily change those power relationships. So, and this is a whole book, but this is what I mean by strategies and tactics. So tactics are these moments, and this is what these artists meant when they said tactical media. But this is a little tricky in the digital age Because whereas like in a media ecology, in an environment of old school media products, it's a little easier to imagine what it means to take that billboard and flip it on its head. When in a digital ecology, in the world we're living in now, where these apps like Facebook and Google, they're not just tools, they are also our environments. We don't just use Facebook, we live on Facebook. So in this digital ecology, what it means to use these systems in a way that they weren't intended is tricky, because how do you misuse a system that is itself designed to be used? Media was designed to be consumed, and so when you, just by remixing it and using it, you're kind of flipping this on its head, but Facebook wants you to use it. And how do you know that you're using it in a way that they don't want you to use it? This was sort of the question that Kurt Kleininger, a new media artist, internet artist, asked in sort of in the early days of social media, when a lot of net artists were sort of debating what our relationship to these platforms should be. And he said, how do you hack / resist a platform that already allows, indeed invites, you to customize it? Either we have arrived at an open source utopia and we simply need to keep using these social networking tools appreciatively in the ways that they afford, or the agency of our radical resistance has been rendered irrelevant because the corporations have decided to let the people eat cake. The agency that Certeau's consumer enacted to tactically reassemble the one-to-many media broadcasted to her in 1980 is being increasingly usurped by institutionally recommended and protocologically enforced modes of interactive behavior. Once the consumer mistakes these institutional suggestions for exercises in her own tactical agency, she fails to exercise that actual agency. With so many customizable options available, how can she resist? The danger of MySpace and YouTube is not the threat that they may wind up archiving and owning all of the content I produce, so that is a problem, or that they are currently getting rich off the content I produce, which is another thing we could talk about, but more importantly, that they control the parameters within which I produce my original content. So again, how do you misuse a platform that is so carefully designed to control the way you use it? If you post an anti-Facebook article on Facebook, is that an act of resistance, or are you just generating the data that they want you to generate? If you take part in a Facebook protest where everybody switches their profile icons to an image of Mark Zuckerberg beaten up, which is a thing I saw a few years back, is that an act of resistance, or is that, again, playing by their own rules? Here's my suggestion, my answer to this question. Avoid this area in red. Do not interact with anything in here, and instead focus on the rest of the browser. The web browser is my absolute favorite application of all the applications. I have an entire series where I get into that. This is a side note, a digression, but I think it's, especially for artists, I think it's one of the most malleable and creative meta apps that exists. And there's a lot that we can do on this web page using the rest of the browser, using the green area. So I'll walk you through some examples. The address bar, we typically just put URLs in there, but you can actually put code in the address bar. If you paste that line of code into the address bar, for example, it'll turn the page red. Say you're on a page with some unpleasant imagery and you'd like to change that. If you copy paste this code into the address bar, you'd get a nicer version of that page. The browser, so that's the address bar, right? Now the browser has all these developer tools built into the browser. These are tools that are there so that web developers can like debug their code. Like when they're working on a web app, they use this to kind of fix issues and stuff. But ultimately, these web developer tools allow you to change the pages that you're on, to interact with these applications beyond that interface. So these developer tools can be sort of misused or differently used. That's how I sort of did this project. This is a project from 2014 called How to Why Leave Facebook, where it's a video essay where I explain why I decided to leave Facebook, all the aforementioned reasons. But more importantly, maybe how I decided to do that. So I had, I've spent 7 years on Facebook, had tons of my information on there, met tons of people, made a lot of important connections. Like my time on Facebook was very special to me, but I didn't like where that platform was going, and I didn't like the terms and agreements, and I wanted to leave. But Facebook gives me two options, like I can delete my account or I can deactivate my account. and I couldn't really do that, in part because I had my account associated with all sorts of other applications and accounts, so that was going to create a whole domino effect of problems for me, but also because I used the Facebook API to do other projects, and so I needed, and I'll explain what an API is in a sec, but I needed to maintain my account in order to do other things. And so I decided I'd leave Facebook on my own terms of conditions, and I'd use the browser tools these developer tools to do that. So what I did is I wrote a series of scripts, a whole bunch of little code snippets that people could copy and paste into these browser developer tools that would let you do things like like delete all of your posts, all of your photos, all of your messages, unfriend all of my friends, like scrape all of my data off the surface, but still maintain my account in existence. I still had that account. I still have that account. It's just the ghost of an account. And then also, it would I wrote some scripts to sort of let you download your data. At this point, Facebook didn't really have any good way to let you take your data with you. Now they've added a little bit of a download feature, but it's still pretty incomplete. Like for example, you can download all the photos you've uploaded, but you can't download photos that your friends have uploaded. And there's some sense there, I get it, but I wanted all of my photos. So this is me running the script where you can download all of the photos you've uploaded, but also the photos that your friends have uploaded. And there's other videos like this in the series. So how I did that, I want to do a little demo, a little quick demo. I'm trying to do this fast for time. To kind of show you how this works with these developer tools. Okay, so say for example, you came across, you're on a dating app, came across a profile image, you're very interested in this person, you start having a conversation, and you start to think am I being catfished? Is this the person they say they're being? So, you go onto Google, you do a reverse image search, and you take your profile photo, you try to figure out where else, if anywhere else that profile photo is on the internet. That brings you to an Instagram page. And you're like, oh, who are these folks? BTS, is this photo on here? And then this happens. People have been in this situation, not just on Instagram, on a web page. You're about to read like an article, and a big wall says like, oh, you have to like log in with Facebook or Google or something in order to read this article. So you can right mouse click this page, and there's this option called Inspect Element, which will open up these developer tools. And now you can actually see all the different elements that make up this page. And if you've done a little bit of CSS or HTML before, there's a property in CSS called display that'll show things or not show things. And I can add here a little bit of CSS that just says display none, and that goes away. Now I could try to scroll, but my scrolling is disabled. If I scroll up a little bit in these developer tools, notice that there's another little snippet of CSS here. It says overflow hidden. This is how you prevent scrolling on a web page when there's a lot of elements. So I could just uncheck that feature, and now I can keep scrolling on Instagram. So again, I'm using Instagram in a way that Instagram does not want me to use it, because I avoided using their interface and instead used other aspects of the browser. Say for example, now I've confirmed that this person was catfishing me, but I've found some cool pics in here that I might want to keep for other reasons. And I love this one, and I want to use it. I can't drag this off the browser like I can any other image on the internet. Nor can I right mouse click and choose like Save Image As, which you could do on most any other website, because Instagram doesn't want me to take any photos from their website. So instead, if I inspect element, I'll notice that there's this like invisible just wall over the image that's preventing me from clicking it. So if I display none on this guy and remove it, now I get that Save Image option, and I can now save the image onto my computer. Cool. So this is how I did the Facebook project. I sort of investigated using these developer tools, figured out what code I needed to change in order to do what I wanted to do, and then I made those little code snippets that other people would copy and paste into their developer tools. And then, should they want to, they could leave Facebook on similar terms and conditions that I left Facebook. So the browser tools aren't the only things, the only avenues for tactical misuse in the browser, or the developer tools rather. There's also browser add-ons and extensions. I love browser add-ons and extensions. I hope that these stick around. You know, when we look at like mobile browsers and now like virtual reality browsers, the ability to add add-ons and extensions is kind of disappearing. This is something that only really happens in the desktop browsers. But it adds extra functionality to the browser. That's what this is for. But you could also change the websites you're on, and some of my favorite artists have leveraged this for this reason. For example, Benjamin Grosser did this piece called Facebook Demetricator. So this is a Facebook add-on, or sorry, a browser add-on. You install in your browser, and it removes all the numbers from Facebook. And Grosser, who also has a piece back there by the bathrooms. This is another awesome add-on. This one by Lauren McCarthy, this was in response to that Facebook. Lauren, who also is head of P5JS, which also has a big presence at this event. This was in response to that emotional contagion experiment, the mood manipulator experiment that Facebook did after that article came out. Lauren kind of went through their paper, figured out what it is that they're doing, and then created an add-on that you can install into Facebook. And when you add it, or in your browser, when you add it, this box gets injected into your Facebook account, which lets you control the emotional tone of your news feed using the same natural language processing techniques that Facebook was using to control. So they kind of sort of puts that control, that agency in the users, and it's super awesome and brilliant project. Another avenue of tactical misuse is APIs. So for folks who don't know, this term stands for Application Programming Interface. These are developer tools that, rather than being built into the browser, are actually made by those companies, by Facebook and Google, to kind of, for all kinds of reasons, but it kind of gives you access to some of their information, some of their tools. So like, if you've ever seen like a Facebook Connect button on another app, that's the developer of that app using the Facebook Connect API to allow you to authenticate into the application. Or if you've ever seen an application that has like Google Maps built into it, like Lyft or Uber, that's those developers using the Google Maps API to integrate the Google Maps into their application. So I love seeing if I can misuse these APIs in this tactical way. So this is sort of unreleased project. This was an experiment that I did one weekend where I thought, could I use Google's API to undermine their business model? So Google, again, the idea is they give us all these free services so that they can get all of our data. So, every email you send, they record that, analyze that. Every chat message you have, every doc you upload to Google Docs. So I was like, could I get the free Google Docs, this free storage for documents, without actually giving them the information in my Google Doc? And so I built a separate app here. So I've got two tabs open. There's my app and Google Drive. So this is a Google Drive account that I created to test this. I've got 3 files on there that just look like this. They look like gibberish. But when you log in through my app, you now see those same 3 docs on the side here, on the side panel. And if you click on one, it asks you for a password. If you type in that password, that doc gets decrypted. And then you see what the contents of that doc in this other app. So now we're off of Google. So here I can edit that doc. And then what I do is at the bottom, I name it and I create a password for that doc, which is then used to encrypt that document before uploading it to Google Drive. So it gets uploaded to Google Drive, is just the encrypted documents, and then what I see on my app is the decrypted documents. So I'm using the Google Drive API in order to do that, in order to get access to uploading and downloading files. But I'm only ever uploading and downloading encrypted files. Another example of that, so YouTube. I love YouTube as a cultural space. So many of my favorite artists I've discovered there and have been so inspired by stuff I've seen on YouTube. But the YouTube algorithm is problematic. It's only gotten worse and worse over the years. I did this collaborative piece with a former collaborator of mine, Anna Russet, who's also deep into YouTube. And she was talking about how when she first got on YouTube, it was a lot easier for people to find your stuff, to discover your stuff. But now there's this algorithm, this mediator between people watching YouTube and people uploading YouTube that decides what gets seen and what doesn't get seen. And the decisions are all based on sort of their business model. In this case, they're trying to keep people there as long as possible so they can generate as much money as possible, and that algorithm has had all kinds of negative unintended side effects. This is an article from The Guardian from a couple years ago where they talk about how that algorithm, the recommendation algorithm, sends people down sort of these dark extremist rabbit holes. And unless you're making that dark extremist content, it's hard to get people to your videos. So Anna used to say that uploading a video to YouTube for her felt like she was like stuffing a message in a bottle and throwing it in an ocean and hoping that somebody would get it. So we used the YouTube API to make that ocean. I don't think this is going to work. Oh, look. Little work. And we can talk about why it's recently stopped working in terms of their API. But I'll maybe come back to that. But I've got documentation here. So this is what it looked like up until a few weeks ago. What's happening is every time somebody uploads a video to YouTube, like this is in real time, a bottle falls from the sky. And if you click that bottle, an icon shows up, and if you click the icon, you can watch the video. And usually there's no views, it's literally just been updated, and so you're the first person sort of watching this video. But what you're getting, instead of the algorithmic feed of what Facebook wants you to watch, we've sort of replaced it with a chronological feed, like how all these apps used to work, which is like what's being uploaded right now. And the way we did that was using YouTube's search API, using a very convenient little hack, a little oversight the developers I think didn't really take into account when they created that API, that essentially allowed us to just get a raw stream of whatever was currently being uploaded, or at least some percentage of it, because the reality is way more videos are uploaded every second than what you see raining down. Like this is actually almost like a squeezed sort of bit of it. So those are some examples of the how and the what. I want to just close with a couple quotes here. This is from media theorist Doug Rushkoff. He says, ask any kid what Facebook is for, and he'll tell you, Facebook is here to help me make friends. No, they're looking to figure out how to monetize people's relationships. If you don't know what the software you're using is for, then you're not using it, but being used by it. This is kind of a big part of the impetus for me behind this sort of work, is helping people understand what these apps are for, how potentially you're being used by it, and maybe how we could actually flip that and actually use it when it looks like to use it and reclaim a little bit of agency, whether that's, again, by sort of experiencing some of these pieces, or hopefully in my ideal world, by taking part in this sort of practice, by diving into these developer tools, playing with them, experimenting with them, not necessarily to become like a web developer or anything, but to at least momentarily, in this tactical way, reclaim a little bit of agency. But back to the point I made before about this is a much larger problem. These collective problems require collective agency. But I think it's good to remind ourselves. This is a quote from Audre Lorde. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. I think fundamentally, like I said before, social media, I love the spec, hate the implementation. The only real fix to this is brand new implementation. So yeah, thanks. That's my. I think we got to it. Yeah, time for some chats. Yeah. That was a lot. Any pieces there? Yeah.
Curious if you could talk about tactics to counter, I guess, some of what you're talking about. I feel like often when I go to like artistry websites or something like that, like you get a notifier like this site is unsafe, like that to safety.
Oh yeah.
And you were talking about how like the one YouTube current YouTube site stopped working.
Yeah, I should mention most of the projects I've shown no longer work.
Yeah. So
not just the current. Current is the most recent to break.
I assume that's not targeting you in particular, but more general, just to try and funnel people towards corporate properties or something like that? Or
I mean, to be honest, it really just has to do with the nature of these systems. And it's not even an intentional sabotage. It's just built into how this stuff works. And this is also why, I use this word tactical specifically in this Certeauian way, because part of the idea is like these are momentary like flips. These are in long-term sort of approaches. In this case, the reason that's the case here is because these systems are never static. They're always being updated. So like I showed you how I went to a specific element in the Instagram page, display none, and then I could save the photo. Instagram is always updating the construction, like the design of their page, just because they're trying to make certain improvements, they're trying to optimize engagement, and this is why it changes, sometimes multiple times a day in certain apps in certain cases. And that update sometimes means moving around those elements, and that means if I made a plugin or code that people are copying and pasting, things aren't where they were before, and so the code isn't operating in the same way anymore. It just sort of stops working. They might have no idea I even made that, and they probably have no idea I made that add-on or that plugin. They're just making their updates. So the fact that this is always updating, same with those APIs and developer tools, because they're always updating, it means if you want a piece like that or, you know, sort of tactic that has to keep working, you also have to keep updating it. And in the case of artists, you know, artists are, I feel like, addressing a lot of ideas, tackling a bunch of stuff, always moving on to the next sort of thing, and they're less interested in maintaining an application, and more like, this is a project that I'm trying to convey certain ideas with. Now I've conveyed those ideas, and now there's new ideas I want to convey. But these are very similar techniques to what certain activists use, digital activists, and in those cases, they do the work of keeping those add-ons up to date, and making sure that every time there's a change, they update their stuff. And so it's like a cat and mouse game. But yeah, some people do. Just usually not artists. Yeah.
So these developer tools are still from Chrome, just from Google.
Well, in my case, I'm using Firefox.
Firefox.
Yeah.
Like, what happens? Like, how do you step outside all of it? Right? Do you just not engage with the internet?
Well, why would you step outside of all of it?
I don't know. It's just like, I'm reminded of that Audrey Ward quote, right?
Yeah.
So you're still using the tools that are like designed for developers.
Yeah, so I think it's important to differentiate the browser from the applications running in the browser. This is kind of why I said before why I love this sort of app. The browser is almost like a meta app. By itself, has no specific purpose other than to let you access other stuff that other people have made. And so the business models, the ideas, the politics that find their way into the applications are different in terms of what finds its way into the browser itself and what finds its way into the apps we're using within the browser. And like I said before, like, I love the internet, and I don't think we should stop using it, stop participating in it. I think it just needs to look different, and the terms need to be different. And that particular issue has more to do with those platforms, Google and Facebook, than the browser itself. This gets blurry when we talk about Chrome, right? Because Chrome is a browser and also Google. But this is also why I don't use Chrome and I use Firefox. You know, like I usually oftentimes tell my students, and this is also big oversimplification, but like when I'm teaching them to code and we're doing this stuff, I'm like, and we're opening up the browser for the first time, I explain this thing we're working on will work on any browser. You know, you can use Chrome if you prefer to have everything you do recorded and tracked, or you can use Firefox if you prefer not. And the option is yours.
Well, I'm currently in a computer vision machine learning class,
Yeah.
and we're using P5.
Cool.
And as of last week, there's something we're doing in this class that is broken in Firefox and only works in Chrome.
Yeah.
So it's like, there are times where, you know, and to say that the browser is just this meta application, like, I'm sure Chrome exists for Google to profit from.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and again,
And if that becomes
that's
the
Chrome
browser,
versus the browser, right? Like the idea of a browser, and thankfully we still have more than just Chrome, so we can still think of it this way, as like there's a browser, and but yeah, this is a super important point. Like in the case of Chrome, which is this middle ground, it is that surveillance capitalist entity producing the meta app. This is why they do it. This particular issue of something working in Chrome and not in other browsers, usually this is temporary, because what happens with browsers is that Chrome doesn't, there's like a separate group, the W3C, which is open to anybody to join, and it's these people who decide what should the web look like, how should it work, what defines a browser. And these folks decide what that's going to be, and so this is the specification, like I was referring to before, and then it's implemented by people who make browsers, Mozilla, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and then a whole bunch of other people making a whole bunch of cool experimental browsers, Brave, Beaker browser, etc. And so there's a little bit of time, there's a little bit of a delay between here's a new spec and here it is implemented. And Chrome's just really good at beating everybody to it, which means when you want to use something that's brand new, some brand new spec, probably sometimes you have to do it in Chrome. Now, I'd say, like I do this stuff all the time, constantly making stuff for a browser. And these days, Chrome and Firefox are they're usually both there pretty quick. So this is more the exception than the rule, but it does happen. I'd say you could use Chromium which is an open source version of, it's what Chrome is kind of built on. So there's like a Chrome that isn't Chrome in terms of like without all the malware built in, just all the nice spec. So that's like, you know, just a quick answer, but yeah.
What about extensions? So are those extensions just for Firefox and just for Chrome? They work fine.
Yeah, so typically, so it used to be the case that you had to make, when you made a browser extension or an add-on, you had to write special code for that browser. These folks that make these standard specifications that I was referring to before are starting to now create a spec for add-ons so that you can now make one code base and deploy it to both browsers. And that's starting to work. Like last year with my students that made browser add-ons, we were able to just finally do one code base and it worked on both without having to do any different code. But it's really those two browsers that are most equipped to have these add-ons. It's Firefox and Chrome. They both have like add-on stores. So what happens is you develop an add-on, you submit it to the store, which then makes it easy for anybody else to install it in their browser. And I say store, these are mostly all free. People share these. But
So if I want to find your extension, I would go to this store, or would I go to your?
So you have both options, actually, yeah. So it's the experience is easier at the store because it's like one click, there it is installed. But like if an artist makes, this is an issue with app stores in general. Sometimes, especially for artists, you make things that are, like I said before, maybe illegal but not necessarily unethical, or that otherwise rub the people who produce, like manage the stores the wrong way. There was a John Cage app that was submitted to the App Store that got rejected because Apple was like, this is dumb. 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, who cares about this? So sometimes it's just on that premise that things get rejected. But fortunately, in the context of browser add-ons and app stores, you can get it on someone's computer without actually having to go to the store. There's just like 3 clicks instead of 1. So oftentimes I'll share add-ons that way, and I'll try to I'll try to be really clear about the steps of like, go to this settings page in your app in your browser, click this button, check this box, and then upload this code I'm giving you. Yeah. Though I should mention, like those other the Ben Grosser and the Laura McCarthy piece, those are add-ons. The stuff that I was doing wasn't an add-on. So instead, I give you my code, you open the browser tools, and you just paste it in. Yeah. Yeah.
Question about the privacy policy part of your talk.
Mm-hmm.
Like I get the whole like your friends are there, so you want to join Facebook or whatever. But
Yeah.
there's also lots of things that require you like privacy policies.
Yeah.
That are seemingly necessary for life these days, right? Like your cell phone provider or your bank or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what do you do in that case? Like, I feel like as an individual, you have very little bargaining power to just go to the next person, right?
Right.
And so, then what?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a project that I started and abandoned where I was I didn't know exactly what this was going to turn into, but I was like, I'm going to read every privacy policy, every terms and agreement I'm met with for like a week, and then see where I go. I lasted a day.
Yeah, I think I read an article the other day that said that someone did a study on this, and if you were to read all of the privacy policies that the average person encounters in a year, it would be like 50 days worth of reading.
Exactly. So the system we have is like obviously not a reasonable one. It should be illegal. It's just not yet. And this goes back to what I said before in terms of like the big problem, systematic problem, requires these large-scale changes. Tactical misuse is not the approach to dealing with this in particular. We really just need to change the way we do terms and conditions, the way we do privacy policies, so that it's fair, so that it's not just really like this trick to give them everything. I think step 1 is like having that conversation, having people realize why that's necessary. Step 2, we get people invested in wanting to see that change. Step 3, we have people who are really good at the policy side of things to figure out, how, either whether we go the policy route or whether we go the corporate pressure route, like whatever the strategy is going to be, to start to see change in the way that agreement is established and then implemented.
Yeah, I mean, I've had those conversations with people, and even like people who are in art school and like you would think would be interested in this sort of thing, and they're like,
Yeah, and I think this is the point of those first few slides, right? Where explain the kind of data, what the predictions are, how the manipulation happens. Where I feel like apathy, but it's really I think it's more ignorance than apathy, and I don't mean that like people are dumb. I just mean people are unaware of like really what's going on. Like I said, when I did that first piece, Trust for Privacy, people didn't even know that this was the exchange, right? People now are a little less ignorant and they understand data is being collected. That's this is the exchange. But now we're at that point where people are like, but I'm cool with that. And I think they're cool with their idea of what that is. I don't think people would be cool with the reality. Like, I don't think people would be cool with that. The example I gave of the mouse movements, right? They're like, oh, if you have Parkinson's and you don't know yet, they're going to let your insurance company know, and then they're going to raise your premiums before you even figure that out. Or another example I've seen, I don't have it up because I don't have sources, and I don't like to make sure this can seem like tinfoil hat wearing stuff, so everything's pretty heavily sourced. But I have a friend whose wife works at Google who was telling me that Google had been running some internal experiments where they could predict when one of their employees was pregnant before potentially she knew she was pregnant. So what does it mean for an employer to have that information before you do? So I feel like I don't think people would be as apathetic to the reality of that situation if they really understood what it meant to give them data. So again, we've made progress. People are getting it more than they did 10 years ago, but there's still a lot more education to happen.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to your point, I think there's a lot of parallels in so many other realms of our society. I mean, when I'm talking to people about race or heteronormative, whatever, structures, I mean, some people there's a cognitive dissonance, they don't want to deal with it, or they just are unaware or ignorant to your point. So I think this is kind of, to me, highlighting just a larger conditioning,
right.
That's nefarious. I mean, when you talk about like the Tuskegee experiments and they were injecting people with syphilis, I mean, there's been some nefarious things that have happened under the auspices of our government, and so this is maybe a distillation into a technology.
Yeah, one slice of it, yeah.
Not to be too cynical, but I think, you might want to look at the larger.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, you're totally right, yeah. And you kind of like implied this too, like these practices then get normalized, and so it's easy to kind of overlook.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the big problems with this, like with the Facebook stuff, is like railing against that normalization of the lack of privacy, or however we want to contextualize it, and reminding people like this isn't normal, this is new, and hopefully we'll be old soon.
I think it's also interesting recently to see the sort of meta scraping that's starting to happen, where it's one thing to have Facebook have all your data and then sell some of the information, but was it the Clearview or ClearNet app that's been scraping pictures from like all platforms, and so.
And also Cambridge Analytica was sort of.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so like that becomes even more interesting of like, yeah, it's not even just about one company anymore, it's about grabbing all the things from all the places.
Yeah. Somebody did, speaking of studies on terms and agreements and privacy policy, somebody did a study where they followed, so one of the lines in the dense document is, you allow us to share this data with our third parties. So they picked one terms and agreements, they figured out what are their third parties, and then those had similar terms and agreements, and what were their third parties, and it's like the amount of people you're agreeing to give your data to with that one terms and agreement is massive. And those are the people who are getting that data through the official channels. The situation with Cambridge Analytica and all the scrapers is that they're technically breaking the rules. They can do it, technically speaking, but they're not supposed to. Facebook says you're not supposed to get the data this way. So then there's all those actors. And then there's when somebody hacks into a system and they have all this information on someone and then they dump this data. And so, yeah, there's there's folks in the tech world, the kinds of folks that are hardcore about tech ethics. One of the long-standing sort of practices in terms of the data you keep is keep what you need to make this app work. Don't just consume and keep all of the things, because the stakes are too high, because you're not going to be the only one with this data. But yeah, the practice in large part has been, no, keep all of it, because we'll figure out how we can monetize it later, and then there's all these side effects. Yeah. Good time. Okay, cool. Thanks, everybody.